Thank you. Is the sound level good? You guys all hear me? Good. If I get too loud, because I'll do that as I get excited, somebody, give me this and I'll move the mic down so that I don't damage anyone's hearing. Thanks for the introduction. Also, thank you to the organizers, Julie and Rick, as well as the board for giving me the opportunity to bring this message to you guys today. So the topic here is, can engineering management make the world a better place? And you might object to that, right? Because you might say, well, we already make the world a better place, right? Bridges don't fall down, the power stays on, water's safe to drink, and these are all important contributions that we make to the world around us. But there's another challenge. Obviously, challenges come up all the time, but there's a challenge on our horizon that we need to start getting ready for and we need to start equipping our students for. And this is the challenge, the opportunity and the challenge of leading neurodiverse employees. Now that may be a term that's new to a lot of us. What is neurodiversity? What does it mean? It's normally taken to mean folks on the autism spectrum. Sometimes Asperger's syndrome is quoted as part of that. Asperger's syndrome, I think that's fallen out of favor in terms of the diagnostic manuals these days, but you still hear it referred to. Some folks even will expand that definition to include attention deficit disorder. And how common is it? 1 in 68 people is the common number that you hear. It's probably a little bit low, so that's about 1.5% of the population. It's generally accepted that girls are underdiagnosed, since the diagnostic tool that's relied on was developed by observing the behavior of boys. So it doesn't always catch autistic behavior in girls. I know there's folks working on that, but that's the reality at least of today. And then, also in the technologies, this is a result from work done at Microsoft. You got to love this terminology, right? This wordsmithing. A not insubstantial minority. And the researcher who did this, I spoke with her and I tried to get a number from her and she wouldn't give me a number. So I guess she's going to try to publish it, so more power to her. The thing that's of concern to us is 80 to 85% of these guys are unemployed or underemployed. College degree, no college degree, computer science degree, it doesn't matter. 80 to 85% unemployment or underemployment. And just to put that in perspective, that's equal to 3.5 times the workforce of the entire city of Philadelphia. So for everybody in this city who's got a job, from the top of the Comcast tower to every hoagie shop in every neighborhood in the city, there's 3.5 people, just U.S., sitting at home, unable to contribute, unable to establish financial independence that comes with employment, even though they have the ability often and certainly the desire to make this contribution. So that's the challenge that's in front of us. Why do we care? Obviously, as neighbors, as family members, as community members, we care. But as leaders, a lot of folks in this room, you're responsible for running part of your university, right? Your responsibility is to be good stewards of the tuition money that your students and their families and their employers entrust you with. We train students to go out into the world and be leaders in organizations. Well, their job is to look out for shareholders, to be good stewards of government, of taxpayers' money. So why is this our problem? John Elder Robison. If you ever get the opportunity to listen to John speak or read one of his books, take it. Really interesting character, very inspirational story, very educational story. So John's a very talented electrical engineer. He designed the first circuit. This isn't it. This is just something I pulled off the internet. But he designed the first circuit that could digitize a human voice. He also designed some really interesting circuitry that could filter out the magnetic effects of the electromagnetic pulse resulting from nuclear detonations. So this is some pretty high-powered engineering that this guy's doing. And the amazing thing to me is when you listen to John speak, and he talks about how he did this design work, he would envision the waveform in his head that he needed to create, and then build the circuit right from that vision in his head. And we're talking about the human voice and electromagnetic pulses. I mean, these are really complicated waveforms. And I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm a mechanical engineer, but I understand these waveforms are time variant. You know, so the next time I talk to John, I get the opportunity, I got to ask him if he envisioned these in Laplace space, or, you know, how do you envision a time variant thing? So, obvious, and John, just as an interest, point of interest, John also designed and built all of the trick guitars used by Gene Simmons of Kiss. So all of these guitars from back in the day in the 80s and 90s that, you know, spewed smoke and fire and sparks or whatever, well, John made these. And if you read his books, he traveled with these bands and got into all the trouble you'd expect a young man to get into traveling around with rock and rollers. And you got to ask yourself, a guy with this type of engineering career, and he went on to be, you know, the R&D manager of the company he worked for. The guy with this kind of engineering expertise, what's he doing hanging around with a bunch of rock and rollers? Well, John dropped out of school in 9th grade. That was the end of his formal education. He dropped out of school at 9th grade because he didn't fit in. Asperger's syndrome, and Aspie as John refers to himself. So, you know, didn't make eye contact, didn't get social cues, socially awkward, all of the things that would make life hell to a 9th grader, right? He didn't fit in, dropped out of school. His parents were on the faculty in the University of Massachusetts, so all the administration people and the security people knew him. He snuck into the university at night and went into the electrical engineering labs, played with the equipment, and taught himself electrical engineering. I could not teach myself electrical engineering. It would never happen. Maybe some of you guys could. I could never do this. So this is an amazingly capable individual who left the company he worked for because he was afraid people would find out he wasn't a real engineer, because he dropped out of school in 9th grade. And he started his own business fixing cars. Very successful at it. So what's the role of management? What would you do if you were the head of the engineering department and you had somebody like John working for you? What would you do to make sure John could fit in and make his contribution? Okay, I've ran engineering departments, and I know what I would do. I would tell all of your neurotypical engineers, you better find a way for John to fit in. If this guy leaves and goes to the competition because you guys didn't make it possible for him to fit in, you guys got a problem with me. I got to fire you guys. You know, so I would do whatever it took to make sure that this guy would fit in and make this very, very valuable contribution to this company. Okay, so you talk about this and you say, all right, Tom, I mean, this is a unicorn, right? This is a black swan. This is genius level ability. And all, 1.5% of the population can't be at this level, and they're not. You got guys like, examples like John Robeson that I just talked about, Temple Grandin on the Colorado State University, faculty that you may have heard about. They made a movie about her. She's also on the autism spectrum. But in addition to that kind of really world-class talent, there's more unspectacular, I don't want to call it mundane contributions, but less spectacular contributions. Things like attention to detail, data entry, check processing. At Wells Fargo in Center City here in Philly, they had a heck of a time keeping people in the check processing department, because you had to repetitively process the checks, and you had to be very accurate, and you had to get it right over and over and over again. And they couldn't keep people in that job. And I understand why. Because if you hired me to do that job, I would leave at lunch and not come back. I could not do that. But some of these guys, that's in their wheelhouse. That's their skill set, their comfort zone. And they just dive in there. And this is what Wells Fargo has done at their check processing facility in Center City, and it's been a real success. The other image I've got here is the Israeli Defense Force recruited 100 autistic young people about 2 years ago into a special unit to do nothing but image analysis, to look at aerial photography frame after frame, hour after hour, all day long, and look for minute changes between them and detect things that are going on. Again, if you hired me to do this job, I'd be gone by lunch. It just wouldn't happen. So there's skills, there's contributions that can be made. But what's the role of leadership? how do we enable this? How do we empower this? So my first inclination of this, I want to ask you guys to humor me while I tell a story about my first time as a chief engineer, and when I ran into this for the first time without knowing about it. And as a chief engineer, how am I measured, right? Nobody measured me on whether I was inclusive or whether I had a diverse team or whether I was, taking care of people, because I really want to make this point. The topic I'm talking about here is not charity. This is not altruism. This is a value proposition. This is good business. The folks that are driving this and the contribution we as a profession have to make to it is about business. It's not about altruism. And I was not measured by, in Jack Welch's GE on my level of altruism. Did the project work? Did I get it done on time? And did I meet the budget? That was what I was measured on. So the first project I got, I mentioned it briefly in the industry discussion yesterday. It was this really cool project. It was DARPA, and if you've ever worked with DARPA, they don't do anything that's plain vanilla. And we were going to build this projectile, and we were going to shoot it out of a gun, and we were going to communicate with it and steer it and shoot down missiles with it. And this was back in the 90s when people didn't think that stuff could be done. And so this was a really cool project. I was really excited about it. And they gave me a great team. I had 12 years of experience at this point in time, and my team members ranged from 25 years to 35 years. So I was scared of my team. I was intimidated by the mission. I was intimidated by my team, and my management didn't think I could do it for the budget we had to propose to win it from the Navy. But I didn't let anybody know that, right? Fake it till you make it. So I acted really confident, but I wasn't. And as I started working on the project, so they gave me this team of real superstars. And as I started working on it, one of the things I had to do was, and you guys will appreciate this, most audiences don't know what a 6 degree of freedom simulation is, so it's really good to have a room full of people that understand that. So part of the project was to do a 6-DOF simulation. Trying to shoot down a missile that's taking evasive maneuvers at supersonic speed, you got to really simulate this a lot to get it done well. And there was a guy in our business that ran the 6-DOF lab. And I didn't know him real well. I saw him around, and he kind of, kept to himself, and his hair was a little bit askew, and his clothes didn't quite match, and half his shirt tail was out. But I mean, this is, a building full of engineers. So maybe it wasn't that unusual. Nobody ever uses engineer and fashionista in the same sentence. And in the first meeting, this came up. I did the simulation. It's Bob. And I said, all right, I'll go talk to Bob and get this started. And one of the other guys on my team, Joe, we'll call him Joe, comes to me and he says, let me talk to Bob. I said, why? You're not in the same department with him. I can do this. It's not a problem. You got a lot of other stuff to do, Joe. And Joe was normally a very, very low-key guy, but he really dug his heels in, that he wanted to talk to Bob about this. So I said, okay, that's fine. That's okay by me. And so I told Joe what I needed to do, and he talked to Bob. And I watched the conversation, and Bob, now I recognize it's probably the first autistic individual I ever ran into. I just didn't know what it was at the time. And he's looking at his shoes, and he's kind of, moving around and nodding his head, and no indication that most of us would take that he was understanding a word that Joe said. But then he went off, and he worked like 3 days, and he liked to work in the middle of the night in the lab when management wasn't around to bother him. I understood that. That was, I was jealous of that he could do that. And he came back with the results. And he would brief Joe, and Joe would brief me, and I'd ask Joe questions, and Joe would go back to Bob, and Bob would disappear for another 24 hours and get the answers done. Critical part of this project, that an autistic skill contributed to my success. And all I had to do was make a pretty minor accommodation. Now, if I had been different, right? If I had taken a different approach, and we've all heard people take this approach. If I had taken the approach, no, I want to talk to him. I want to look him in the eye. I want to take the measure of him. It would have been a disaster. It would have been a disaster. And I would have failed. And I've reflected on this over the years, and somebody called me out on this once. They called me out and said, you know what, it's wrong to treat the autistic guy differently. And I thought, wow. And whenever anybody criticizes me, I try to internalize it and examine it and see if there's some validity to it before I counterattack. Usually takes about 15 seconds, and then I counterattack. No. But I thought about this experience, and I made a lot of accommodations to everybody on that team. neurodiverse and neurotypical. One guy was scared to death of political ramifications, not without justification. With different market, it was a tactical market instead of strategic market that we were used to, different test paradigm, and he's the guy that would get called on the carpet if something went wrong. So I had to give him political cover. There was another guy that didn't believe in our new whiz-bang digital circuitry simulation tools. He wanted to do it the old school way with breadboards and brass boards, and that wasn't going to happen because we just sunk $5 million into these new tools. And I had to give him cover. I had to convince him, all right, the business has made this decision, but nobody's pilot tested this yet. If this is a bad idea, it just doesn't hurt our program, it's going to hurt the whole business. So let's take them at their word that this is going to work, but let's make this a pilot test so we can save the rest of the business even if it blows up in our face. And he was okay with that. And and as I thought about this, I did something so that everybody on this team felt comfortable and could make their contribution. So what I wasn't given in my first leadership experience, and I've never been given in any leadership experience, I've never been given the round peg to go in the round hole and the square peg to go in the square. Nobody has ever given me that team. I don't think that team exists, right? This is what I get. This is what we work with, is real people. And real people have terrific skills that they can use to contribute, and they have their idiosyncrasies. They have their irregularities. So this model, this analogy of leadership as building a puzzle, I think is probably the best analogy I've ever come across. Right? Because think of a puzzle. When you build a puzzle, every piece makes a unique contribution, and a critical contribution. The puzzle's not complete without every piece doing its thing. And your job as the puzzle builder or the leader is to find a way for everybody to fit in and make that contribution and make you a success. So why is it any different finding ways for neurotypical people to fit in versus the neurodiverse? So that was my first experience with this world. And so things have been moving on, right? 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, if you were to use the term autism at work, no one would know what you were talking about. So about 6 years ago, SAP, Hewlett-Packard in Australia, and Microsoft started pioneering this. And they started hiring people, specifically mindfully targeting neurodiverse people to be hired into their organizations. For these specific reasons. They're looking for a competitive advantage. One of the competitive advantages is innovation. Right? I call this the EY model, the Ernst & Young model. Ernst & Young opened their first Center for Excellence in Neurodiversity here in Philadelphia, their Philly office, about 3-4 years ago. And they've opened Chicago, Dallas, and I think they're working on a fourth. I don't know where that one is. But they specifically are looking for talent that can invent what they call next-gen technologies. They're looking for people that, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, machine learning. They're looking, the old hackneyed story of, we're looking for, people that can think outside of the box. Yeah, well, some of these guys don't know there is a box, right? Let alone think outside of it. Jobs that require repetitive focus. And this was the SAP model. Their original thought was software testing. Again, you got to get in the zone, and you got to stay focused, and you got to do that for a long period of time. And it's hard to do. And some neurodiverse people are wired to be good at that. So that's the SAP model. This is something that's really an unexpected spillover that's really going to be important. And that's better neurotypical managers. This is a Microsoft finding. They found that when they put a neurodiverse employee on someone's team, that team member, that team leader became a better manager. You can't phone it in anymore, right? You can't take shortcuts. And we all know this, right? We take shortcuts. If we got a team that we can take a shortcut to, we don't always set goals right, we don't always delegate right, we don't always do the accountability right. We just kind of let them run because our boss wants us to do something else. Write a report, write a proposal, do something. So we're not managing our team, we're doing something else, and we kind of let the team manage itself. And we can get away with that most of the time. You got a neurodiverse employee on your team, you're not getting away with that. You got to focus, you got to bring your A game every day. And they found that productivity is going up in these teams, in these groups, dramatically. This is a value proposition that nobody anticipated, and this could be the most important value proposition of this entire thing. And then engagement, employee engagement. SAP can trace a 1% increase in employee engagement every year for 6 years that they've been running this neurodiversity at work program, autism at work program. Now, chief economist at SAP says 1% employee engagement is worth $40 million at the bottom line to SAP. Man, that's a lot of software. That's a lot of money, $40 million for every 1% that they're saying. So they're sold. They are really sold on this as a business proposition, not altruism, not charity. And this is what I tell my students, is that this is the world that's changing. This is the world it's a change that's coming. It's just started. And especially since it's a lot in the technologies, our students are the guys that are going to have to face up to this challenge. So my students, I make sure they know this. And I've had one of my alums went to Ernst & Young, and another's gone to SAP, and they've both become involved in the neurodiversity at work program at those companies. And obviously, you know, they get a lot of visibility, they get a career bump out of this. So this is a competitive advantage not only to these companies, but also to our students. Valuable workplace characteristics. This is what, you know, the 5-6 years of experience has shown. You know, these are what these guys bring to the table. Keen attention to detail, willingness for repetitive activities. I've repeated that several times. Trustworthiness, reliability, timeliness, low absenteeism, almost no turnover in the technology area. That's amazing. Attention to detail and focus can result in them growing into subject matter experts. Most supervisors rate their neurodiverse employees as above average in performance. And many enjoy tasks that are disliked by others, social isolation, repetitive tasks, that type of thing. Okay, but there's a challenge associated with it as well, right? This is not all benefits, it's a trade-off. So the early experience in Microsoft says that this is the challenge. First of all, NDEs. There's a whole language around this, right? And of course there's an acronym. An NDE is a neurodiverse employee. So many neurodiverse employees found out about it in adulthood. They were undiagnosed. And when they are diagnosed, a lot of them refuse to disclose. They won't self-disclose because they're afraid, not without, you know, justification, of negative career results. They will rigidly interpret rules. This was actually one of the experiences from Microsoft. If your handbook says you need these 5 guys at a Scrum meeting, if there's only 4 guys and you go ahead with it anyway, as far as the neurodiverse employee is concerned, you haven't done that meeting yet. You got to do that meeting because you haven't done it right. There's some places and organizations where that type of rigidity is a real problem. There's other places where it's a real asset. We read about stuff in the newspaper all the time, and we sit there as engineers and look at it and say, why did no one say no to this? How could this have happened? Need somebody like that in the chain who's hardwired to say, no, this is not what the rules say. Difficult to focus on what they consider to be the mundane. Not what you and I consider to be the mundane, what they consider to be the mundane. But hyper-focus on what they consider to be interesting. Potentially inappropriate emotions, hostile reactions in design reviews. You know, they don't understand. We understand, right? In design review, we want people to beat us up. We want people to criticize our design. That's how we get it better. These guys aren't they're not putting the cues together. They're not getting that, and they could react inappropriately to that. And obviously, poor communication skills. Perhaps not obviously, but that's one of the findings. So how did I get involved with this? You know, I'm not a psychologist. You know, I'm not a doctor. I'm not an educator in special ed or anything. How did I get involved with this? So I witnessed a family member on the autism spectrum struggle with employment. Good kid. He's put the rest of it together. He's living independently. He just can't crack this unemployment thing. And I was talking to him and listening to him and all this kind of stuff. And suddenly it occurs to me that a big part of the problem is this guy. Okay? Well, maybe not this guy specifically, but the boss. Okay, and it's a pet peeve of mine, and you guys aren't going to be surprised by that. You guys know this, that everything we know about leading teams and organizations just doesn't get done frequently enough in our world. And if we get a bad boss, and we've all had bad bosses, right? Most of us, we get a bad boss, we need the paycheck, we suck it up until we can get our resume out and get the hell out of there and get a better boss. These guys aren't going to do that. They can't do that. They can't just suck it up and let it go. It's going to be a problem. It's going to be a conflict. They're going to shut down. They're going to quit. They're going to lose their job. Where most of us won't. Most of us will find a way to live with it. So I came to this epiphany when I was about 2 years into my doctoral work, and I had this really cool new toy to play with called the literature search. So when I came to this epiphany that we didn't know how to manage neurodiverse employees, I said, well, I can fix this. I can do a literature search. I can find out what scholars have learned about this. I can put it into a workshop for practicing managers. I can make a contribution here. So I did my literature search, and I came up with 0. No research. Nothing had been done. Since then, there's been a little bit. Alicia Parr did her doctoral work at Penn State, I want to say 2 years ago, and she studied transformational leadership, the Bassanio theory, with neurodiversity as a independent variable, excuse me. And she found some interesting findings, right? And she looked at the 4 I's, we're all familiar with this stuff, and the 2 of them, idealized, influenced, and individualized consideration, worked really well, better with the neurodiverse than the neurotypical. One didn't. The inspiration of high expectations backfired. Anxiety went up, organizational commitment went down. Really bad outcome. So you got to start asking yourself, I started asking myself, how many things do we teach new managers, aspiring managers, that don't work? And how do we figure out what they are? So that became my new mission when I realized that there wasn't going to be this plethora of research results that I could rely on. That became my new mission. So, and this is, first couple of bullets are just a repetition of, I stole my own thunder here, I guess. But so what does a good chief engineer do when you've got a problem and you've got no data? You've got no data. Nobody's researched this. Say again?
Get data.
Get data. Okay? But that's long. That takes a long time. Right? So what this chief engineer did was I guessed. I made it up. Right? Make it up, not guess. Intelligent guess. Right? A measured guess, educated guess, and then find a way to test it. So that became what I was trying to do. And I was looking for this, what's the yardstick? How do I make an educated guess? I mean, I could just sit there as a family member and an experienced manager and a scholar and guess, and that would be okay. I'd probably be closer than most just based on that background. But that's not really a great way to do it, right? So I started wrestling with this and struggling with this, and I talked to people, and I got these survey instruments that diagnostic psychologists use, and it was all very cumbersome and hard to use, and it required a lot of training. It just wasn't going to be practical for what I was trying to do. And I actually let this sit on the back burner, because the doctoral work began to eat my life. And this kind of, went to the back burner. And then one day I was on campus at Pace University up in New York, where I was doing my doctoral work. And I was going to lunch. So I went to lunch up on the 18th floor, and I hit the wrong button. I hit the elevator button for the 16th floor. And the door opens, and no kidding, the door opens on the wrong floor, and right in front of me is the Center for Teaching and Research in Autism at Pace University. And I looked at that and I said, wow, isn't that a coincidence? And I went up to the 18th floor and I sat down at lunch, and I started, the folks that I was eating lunch with, I started telling them this story, how I was involved in this, and isn't it coincidental that I just saw this? And one guy, one of my peers, Chris Lowe, he sits across the table and he looks at me, he goes, dude, that's a sign from God. You got to get your butt in gear. Now, is it really a sign from God? I'm probably not a good judge of that, but I figured, why take the risk? So I connected with Mary Cohen, who ran the program back then, And she started introducing me to other researchers and other thinking on the topic. And she introduced me to the work of Francesca Hoppe, an autism researcher at the King's College in London. And Francesca Hoppe has to me, a very practical and useful take on the autistic mind. And she argues that the autistic mind is deep specific skills that are coupled with weak central coherence. And then she goes on to take this psychological term of weak central coherence and interpret it for the rest of us, not getting the gist. Don't connect the dots with what goes on around them. Don't get the social cues. Don't connect things. So this then became, that's the key, right? So this is the yardstick. This is how I guess. How many things do we teach young managers to do that assumes that the person being led gets the gist, can connect the dots? And my students, this is just a repeat of Francesca Hoppe's strong, yeah, okay, that's the whole thing there. So this is my toolkit, right? This is what I teach first-year students, graduate students, that to lead a team, this is what you need to do. You need to be able to do these 9 things. And I actually students contributed to this. I started having debates in my class. I was adjuncting at an MBA program back then, as well as adjuncting with Drexel's engineering management program. And in both venues, I'd have debates. We'd talk about delegation. And then I'd explain this concept of autism and weak central coherence, and then we'd have this debate. What I just told you about how to delegate, how much of this relies on the employee getting the gist? And we'd kick it back and forth, and they helped me make my guess. And we went through, and these things that are in red, these, you could say that all of these are dependent on the employee getting the gist at one point or another. But the ones that are in red are the ones that I said, okay, these are the things that really matter. These are the ones that I've got to figure out what we do differently. And figuring out what we do differently, hopefully someday there'll be research, there'll be real data, but I didn't want to wait. So it was my judgment, and I'll put that out there. And so let's talk about delegation. Just as an example, real quick, I don't want to get into all the details, but Onken and Wass in their famous paper talk about these 5 levels of delegation. You never want to let an employee just wait around and ask to be done. You want to push them up this hierarchy until they're acting and then routinely reporting. Well, if you're really going to expect your employees to see a situation, decide what to do, just act, and then tell you about it a couple months later, boy, they better get the gist. Right? They better be able to connect the dots and what's going on around them. Or they're probably going to get it wrong. And their anxiety is going to go through the roof. So this recommendations that we make to managers on how to manage people is probably wrong. In this one instance, for these guys, my gut feel, and there's no data behind this, there's no science behind this, it's just my gut, is this is the sweet spot here, right? Have them come to you, Tom, I've got an issue, this is what I think we should do, what do you think? I think that may be the sweet spot, and it does 2 things for you. It gives you the opportunity to make sure they're connecting the dots correctly. Excuse me. And it also gives you the opportunity to diagnose how much of the gist are they really getting. Right? So, and I can never remember who said this quote, but there was one of the early autism researchers said that if you take the time to really get to know one person on the autism spectrum, what you know is one person on the autism spectrum. And the next guy is going to be completely different. So this gives you the opportunity to diagnose how much of the gist does this specific individual get. But maybe you can bump this guy up to the next level. Or maybe you can't. Maybe recommend and then act is the top, or maybe that's even a challenge for this individual. But think about what we talked about a few minutes ago, right? We talked a few minutes ago about the unanticipated benefit being neurotypical managers doing a better job. How many managers in industry today do you think take 2 seconds to understand how much of the gist their employees get? Probably none, unless they work for SAP or Microsoft and they have a neurodiverse person on their team. But if you have a neurodiverse person on your team and you know you have to do this, aren't you going to do it for everybody on your team? Probably. You're probably going to be thinking, even if you don't consciously do it, you're going to be thinking about it. Maybe this is why, Mary or Joe blew that last assignment so badly. Maybe they don't get as much of the gist as I think they do. And this is part of this productivity spillover that comes from putting a neurodiverse person on your team. So I had a student back then, as one of my MBA students, who was extraordinarily generous. Her job was the executive director of VIA of the Lehigh Valley, north of Philly. And it was a service provider, and she worked with this population. And she made her entire staff of job developers, job coaches, people who are in the trenches doing this every day, day in, day out, available for me to do a workshop for them based on my educated guesses. And then I could get, data. Then I could start to get some semblance of data, right? In terms of whether they thought I was on the right track or not. So, I did the statistics and the anonymous feedback and all this jazz, and pretty good. Improved my ability to apply these principles, 4.25. Pretty good average. This is on a scale of 0 to 5 too. I guess I should point that out. This is a 5-point Likert scale. So that led me to believe I was on the right track with this. But this, I talked about data. This isn't science, right? This isn't research. We all know this. This is me taking an educated guess and putting some type of a half-baked yardstick against it to get some kind of confidence this is the right thing. Because the research is slow. It takes a long time to generate these scientific principles. And frankly, we don't have the time. There's 3.5 times the workforce of the city of Philadelphia sitting at home right now. It shouldn't be. So the action's got to be faster, and then the science is going to have to catch up with it. But this was some confidence that I was in the right direction. Now, this is a moving target. Right, kind of the downside of this workshop, I sanity checked my workshop. I had confidence in it. So great. Now I've got a workshop that nobody knows they need and nobody really wants. So I think I've put it on actually once for one organization. But I connected over the summer. The Academy of Management Conference in Boston over the summer for the very first time had a section on neurodiversity. Never happened before. That's a big breakthrough. They got a long way to go. They're all asking the wrong questions, and they haven't figured it out what the real issues are yet, but they'll get there. But they've started, and that's a breakthrough. But at that conference, I connected with a woman who is she's a psychologist background, which I'm not. I'm an engineer. She's on the spectrum, which I'm not. And her doctoral research is about the success of neurodiverse people in the workplace and the effect of the manager. And my doctoral research had nothing to do with that. Mine was corporate venture capital innovation. So that's about as far away from this topic as you could get. So she's everything I'm not. And I'm everything she's not. I'm neurotypical. I'm an experienced manager. So we're going to cooperate on the second version of my book that's based on the workshop. And so there's going to be some science in the second version instead of me just making guesses and trying to sell the guess, which frankly is what the first book is. So again, this is a moving target, and we're going to push these things ahead. So, and I tell my students this, right? I tell my students, because I do this as a lecture. What do we know about neurodiversity? What do we know about neurodiversity in the workplace? What do we know about leading the neurodiverse? It's not that big of a deal. It's like half a lecture because we don't know that much yet. Okay? Good news, bad news, right? This is the lecture I get the biggest reaction from. When I hit that point about strong specific skills and weak central coherence, I see light bulbs going off all over the room. And I'll get comments like, oh my gosh, that explains Joe. Oh my gosh, that explains Jane. And every once in a while, I'll get, especially people who work in the technologies, I get, oh my gosh, that explains my boss. I got chief technology officer. We promote people based on technical skills instead of leadership ability. It happens all the time. This is going to happen. John Robeson, he had no people skills. He was a really, really talented engineer. He got promoted to head of R&D based on his technical ability. He quit because he hated the people part of it, and he was afraid he was going to be found out as a fraud. But he shouldn't have been promoted to that. He didn't like it. He wasn't good at it. Man, you should have given him a lab, let him invent stuff, whatever he wanted to invent. Guitars, let him work on guitars one day a week. You know, he would have been a pipeline of innovation for that company, but not management. That's a challenge I haven't figured out yet. You know, how to because the neurodiverse people, they don't want to go into an entry-level job and stay there. You know, just like the rest of us, they want to grow through their career. Now, how do you coach a neurodiverse person who wants to be a manager? I don't know that yet. That's a question I really haven't wrestled with yet. When we get to that, when that's the last question to be answered, we can declare victory, right? That we've really knocked this. So I tell my students this is going to help your career, it's going to help your company, and you're going to help change the world. You're going to do a good thing. So I want to make you guys an offer, and I want to make you guys a challenge. So the offer is, this is my email address. If you email me, I will send you everything I've got. I'll send you my PowerPoint slides that I use to teach this lecture. You can take the Temple University logo off it. I don't care. I want the message out there. I'll send you all of the literature that I've come across, that I've read. You know, the good news is if you spend a Saturday afternoon reading this stuff, you'll become like conversant with the state of the art. The bad news is it should take a whole lot longer than that. We just don't know this much about it. So you email me, and I'll make everything available. You want to talk to me on the phone about how I do the lecture? And absolutely. Whatever I can do so that you guys feel comfortable putting this stuff in front of your students, right? And that's the challenge. Okay, I said it was going to make an offer and a challenge. So the challenge is, we've got all these people, 3.5 times the workforce of the city of Philadelphia, sitting at home. Huge waste of human potential. Not to mention that they can't establish their own independence. This is an unacceptable status quo. What can we do about it? Well, this association represents 389 engineering management programs. So if those programs on average graduate 10 people a year, that's 4,000 new leaders a year. It's 40,000 new leaders in a decade. If we're putting 4,000 leaders a year into the world who are aware of this challenge and aware of the opportunity and have the basic skills to navigate it, we've really done something. Right, so Archimedes, we're all familiar with this, right? Archimedes said, give me a lever that's big enough and I can move the world. 4,000 leaders a year is a big lever. And that's the lever that you've got in front of you. So my challenge is, grasp that lever and move the world. Thank you.